Hi, Ivy. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Carol. It's nice to see you too.
I was futzing with technology and I didn't see you pop into the room.
And I'm fussing with technology myself. Good to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a long time in person.
Yeah. And Patrick, I think it's been years since we met at I don't know if that was the start of the Solar Collaborative or anyway. Been a while.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, read your work.
Thank you.
Appreciate what you do. Yeah.
We all read her work.
Yep.
Yeah, we have about close to 70 people that registered. So
That's great.
Yeah, so that's a really nice turnout. Luke Priddy is Senator Edwards' chief of staff. He will be standing in for the senator today.
Do we know if Delegate Hurst will be here?
I believe so. We haven't heard anything otherwise. Have you, Rick?
No, I assume everything's all right.
Wonder
Senator Edwards is in session still for some of the Senate budget work, I think, so.
Okay, so just the Senate.
Dr. and I just went through and double checked some of our settings and whatnot. It looks good to me. So.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Can you adjust that this slide right now? Luke's last name is spelled Priddy.
Oh, yes, I can. I'll do it right now.
There you go. Thanks.
Now there's Luke now.
Perfect time.
We won't tell him we misspelled his name, will we?
No.
All right. There is Delegate Hurst. All right. Just about ready here. So welcome everybody to the Solar Opportunities and Challenges in Southwestern Virginia Forum. I am Stockton Maxwell. I'm the secretary of the New River Valley Sierra Club, and I'm going to hand off the mic to Rick Shingles, the chair of our group. Rick?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to our forum on solar opportunities and challenges in Southwest Virginia. Before we get into our program, I want to thank the executive committee for the New River Valley group of the Sierra Club. Stockton has introduced himself. He's our webmaster and he's a host. He's our webmaster tonight. He's also our secretary. Josh Cousin, who is our communications chair, and he's our all-around AI tech, and he's making this program tonight possible. Other members of the executive committee are Vice Chair David Jenkins, David Seraph, our public relations chair, and Carolyn Gibbons, pipeline chair. All these people have been working on this for months to make it possible tonight, so I want to thank them for everything that they've done so we can proceed. Tonight we have a very distinguished panel. I'm very proud of our guests tonight. We have 7 people on the panel and our moderator, Ivy Main, and I'll get back to Ivy in a minute, but I wanted to introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll present. And so representing a private sector viewpoint, stakeholder viewpoint, is Patrick Feucht from Baseline Solar Solutions. Carol Davis will present a public sector stakeholder viewpoint. She's town manager, town of Blacksburg sustainability manager. Aaron Schutt will represent a solar advocacy viewpoint. He's the Mid-Atlantic director of the Solar United Neighbors. And then 2 very distinguished guests tonight are the principals negotiating the treaty between Southwest Virginia counties and cities, towns, and Appalachian Power. And James Ervin is the town manager of Rocky Mount, and he's the chair of VACO, Virginia Association of Counties Committee, that's doing the negotiations. And Larry Jackson is the Director of External Affairs for APCo. And we hope tonight they'll share with us at least what are the basic issues that they're negotiating and give us a timeline and whatever other information they can provide. And then these individuals will present in that order, and then there'll be an open period of discussion, approximately 30 minutes, where they can speak to one another. We get to listen to the conversation. When the people that get the last word tonight are people that represent the New River Valley in the General Assembly. Senator Edwards from the 21st Senate District could not make it tonight, but his Chief of Staff, Luke Priddy, is here, and we're very thankful to have you here, Luke. And Delegate Chris Hurst, representing the 12th District of the House, is here tonight as well. They get the last word. We ask them to just listen to what's going on and then reflect a little bit at the end of what issues that were discussed tonight might be pertinent for the 2021 General Assembly. Now, to introduce us to the remarkable 2020 General Assembly that pivoted Virginia away from fossil fuels towards alternative energies and zero carbon emissions, I'm very proud to introduce Ivy Main. She is the Virginia Chapter Chair, Conservation Chair. She's the Renewable Energy Chair. We all know her from Virginia Mercury. She keeps the rest of us informed and helps the rest of us understand the complexities of all that legislation that was passed. She's going to give us an overview of what some of these solar opportunities are that came out of that General Assembly, and then segue, I suppose, to some of the challenges that we'll be discussing tonight. And so with that, I'm very proud to introduce Ivy Main.
Thanks, Rick. So Rick asked me to talk for just 15 or 20 minutes about kind of the lay of the land, what's happened this year that gives us the new opportunities and really giving us a chance to ramp up solar because we now have a framework for a transition to 100% carbon-free electricity. And it's a watershed year for Virginia. It's something that a lot of us have been working towards for a long, long time. I'm gonna pull up my screen. Let's see if I can get this to, all right, here we go. Is that coming across all right?
Good to go.
Excellent. Okay. So the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which I'm going to just refer to as the VCEA, solar freedom, several other new laws passed this year that remove barriers to customer-sided solar and to third-party owned solar and make it much more attractive for developers to put in large solar farms, utility scale solar. And so we're going to talk about what this means for local governments. There's a lot to it, and many of the laws turn out to be different for Dominion Power or Dominion Energy Virginia and for Appalachian Power. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about where the differences are and some of the other issues that we still have, things that we still need to tackle. Why solar? Why now? For governments, the Commonwealth and for local governments, solar is at the intersection of climate and cost savings. So the Virginia Clean Economy Act passed this year puts Virginia on a track to zero carbon electricity by 2050. And that means maximizing energy efficiency, weatherizing homes, replacing fossil fuel plants with wind, solar, and offshore wind. And in a big way, insisting that utilities bring solar and wind into their systems. Some localities have committed to a much faster carbon-free time period. And we've got, if anybody wants it, Sierra Club also has a presentation that talks about tools for local governments that can help get you there faster. But solar is a big part of it. And the good news is that solar is now cheaper than fossil fuels. The cost of solar has fallen so fast and so far that building in solar is not just important for climate, it's important for ratepayers. And displacing fossil fuels also has health benefits and job benefits because solar is so labor intensive. And if you're a local government looking for revenue, welcoming a solar farm into your borders means more tax revenue. So for local governments, it's big. For customers, it is also a great way to save money. And it's not just residential and commercial customers who can benefit, but also local governments because they're utility customers too. And part of the attraction right now is the help from the federal investment tax credit. So that the federal tax credit this year is at 26%. Next year, it's going to go to 22%. After that, it goes away for residential customers entirely and drops to 10% for commercial customers. So that means this next year is really critical. If you're looking to install solar and make money or save money, you really need to be able to do it now, and you know, because we don't know whether the federal government will boost that credit again. Virginia doesn't offer any tax credits itself or rebates, but we do have net metering. And net metering is a program that basically lets you put your surplus solar electricity onto the grid during the day when you've got extra, and then use that as a credit against electricity usage at night. And that makes it affordable for homeowners to do solar. It makes it also, the payback is good enough that commercial customers are typically cash positive from day one. And local governments can do the same thing. They can also use net metering. And so we're seeing that schools in particular, which have a lot of roof space and have a good usage profile for solar, all across Virginia, we're seeing schools go solar. Not so much in APCo territory, and that is one of the things that we will be talking about. How do I move this? That's not it. Come on, baby. There you go. Okay, utility scale solar is a big winner under the VCEA. So we've talked about why solar is important to the grid and to customers. The VCEA promotes solar, and particularly utility scale solar. By that, I mean the large solar farms that can produce enough electricity for hundreds or even thousands of homes and businesses. So the VCEA includes a renewable portfolio standard, which tells utilities to include a certain percentage of renewable energy, and that goes up over time. The RPS is really complicated. I'm not going to go into it here. It is different from, but complementary to, the other requirement in the VCEA that the utilities actually go out and build or buy wind and solar. And you'll see there, APCo has a requirement that it actually go out and propose these wind and solar purchases. It's going to be up to APCo whether it's wind or solar. It depends on what you need for your generation profile, cost, things that the utility has to look at to determine what makes sense for their energy mix. The other thing that we saw this year is that barriers to distributed energy fell. And when I say distributed energy, that's typically rooftop, but it also can be small scale solar in a backyard or on site next to where it's being used. And distributed just means that it's out among the community. So solar freedom, the VCEA, and a separate law targeting homeowner associations all make it easier now for customers to install solar. The net metering cap, which was a limit on how much solar could be net metered in a utility territory, has been raised and will be available at least for the next few years. Standby charges, which were like a tax on large solar arrays, the homeowners who had large solar systems, APCo agreed to eliminate the standby charges. That's one of the areas where APCo actually is doing better than Dominion, because Dominion did not entirely eliminate standby charges in the negotiations over solar freedom. Larger residential and commercial size limits. Homeowner associations, we've had a lot of problems with HOAs trying to prevent street-facing solar arrays. We think we've taken care of that now. It's going to be much harder for HOAs to block solar installations. And then the cap on third-party power purchase agreements was raised. And that's, and we're going to talk more about those. Okay, so third-party power purchase agreements are a way in which the solar developer that puts the solar on a rooftop owns the solar array and sells the electricity to the customer. And that has two really important consequences. One is it means the customer isn't having to pay upfront for the solar. They're paying just for the electricity. The other thing is that the solar developer then can take advantage of the federal tax credit. And that is a critical thing if you are a local government or a nonprofit and you don't have, you're not paying taxes. So in order to be able to get the federal tax credit, the benefits of that, this is a way to do it. It's a financing tool, but because it is considered a sale of electricity sometimes, it's been a problem in Virginia. We, until this year, it was very limited. There was a program that allowed a certain amount in Dominion territory. In APCo territory, it was much less, and it was only for private colleges and universities. This year, the program's been hugely expanded. Now it's up to 40 megawatts in APCo territory. In Dominion territory, it divided into buckets from regular customers and then local government customers and schools in a different bucket. In APCo territory, it's one bucket. So legally, there's nothing stopping local governments and schools from joining others around the state. And we are seeing around the state lots and lots of local governments writing contracts to do PPAs. It's not happening here because of an issue you're going to hear more about later, the contract dispute in which, so here in, well, across Virginia, really, local governments don't buy electricity under a regular rate schedule. They buy it through a contract with the utility. And they're renegotiating the contracts this year. APCo does not want to allow local governments to use PPAs, as I understand it. And I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm misstating that. Obviously, local governments would like to save money for their taxpayers and residents by using PPAs. So we'll hear more about those negotiations. We'll talk about a few of the other issues that we still have. The VCA establishes a framework for the energy transition, but it does have gaps, and we're going to be working to fill those. And Solar Freedom removed many of the barriers to customer-sited solar, but not all. So one of the problems that we hear about a good deal is that the rules are different depending on where you live in Virginia. The VCEA doesn't apply to the rural electric cooperatives, and the rules are different between Dominion and APCo territory. So there are these issues of fairness. Virginia still has very little in the way of incentives to encourage private investment in solar, and we know that we've got a great deal of potential for private investment. So we need to find ways to really promote the use of solar. And one of the problems is that the new RPS doesn't promote distributed generation, which would give the private sector a reason to install solar. So there's no requirement that APCo buy renewable energy certificates from its own customers or from distributed generation. There is a small carve out in Dominion territory, but not in APCo territory. And customers who don't have sunny rooftops or who are renters still have no solar options here in APCo territory. There is a bill that passed that'll do a shared solar program, but only in Dominion territory. And the same thing, a shared solar program for residents of apartment buildings and other multifamily residences will only be available in Dominion territory. And then the last thing on this list you'll see is the issue of the contractual limits. And we will get into that some more. But that wraps up our very fast run through this year's legislation. And I can make these available at some point. Right now, we're going to turn this over to Patrick to talk about his perspective as a solar installer working down here. So Patrick, tell us, how's business?
Thanks, Ivy. Yeah, and so my name is Patrick Feucht. I am co-owner and business manager of Baseline Solar Solutions. We're in Blacksburg, and we're a small business, a solar contractor. Actually, I'm going to share my screen and just show a few things here. So, do that. So this is just a little bit about us. We are, again, here in Blacksburg, 12 years in business. We've got 12 full-time employees, 2 of those that we added this year alone, pretty much directly in response to increased demand that I can tie directly to the legislative changes this year. And our work is with homeowners and commercial building owners. And like I said, we're here in Blacksburg, and we have a second office in Richmond. And the main goal of our business is to help get more renewable energy deployed out there and operating in the world. And just specifically about the legislation this year and effects that it's had for our business. A lot of things you said, Ivy, I'm going to touch on again. One, we kept full retail net metering, and that's super important for the financial viability of the projects from a homeowner scale to a commercial scale. I was really happy to see that was kept. PPAs, the power purchase agreements, that's another big development that will allow those entities, as you talked about, Ivy, to the governments and people who can't afford or don't want to own this to still do it. And we're already getting calls this year from more and more developers who are looking to develop those particular kind of projects. So that has had an immediate direct effect on our business. And some of the things you said, Ivy, about removing hurdles and raising some limits, the HOA, the standby charge, those things have allowed us to do some more projects in places where HOAs haven't allowed them, and to do bigger systems where we would have previously been limited. So those, again, direct positives on getting more solar and renewable energy out there. And we're hopeful about the SREC market. I'm still waiting to see what happens there. In the distant past and in the distant past for us, that was a big financial piece of helping people afford this. And then that kind of faded here in Virginia, going strong in other states, but I'm hopeful for that to come back and see what effect that can have. So, the results, we are seeing more demand this year. We're talking with more developers, we're doing more work. And I've hired, again, I added 2 people to my staff overall this year. And as you said, Ivy, with the tax credit continuing to go down next year, it's probably going to be our busiest year ever, and look to hire more people. So all of this has had really positive effects for our business, and just us seeing renewable energy production, going up by us getting more solar out there, and really looking forward to the larger developments too. So that's what we're seeing. It's been really positive.
That is so good to hear. I got to tell you, it's been a tough year for a lot of people, and to hear the businesses expanding because of the changes in the laws
I have, and one more comment about the PPA, with governments, the public authority folks with APCo here. I know that's getting negotiated out, and there are at least a few projects on some schools that we're talking with a developer about that are on hold right now, just waiting on that to be negotiated. So, just again, on the ground, I know that I'm excited about that to get negotiated out, and hopefully the result is PPAs will be allowed. And I'm confident that will lead to more development here in our area. So
real consequences for the outcome of these negotiations. Carol Davis, we're going to turn it over to you from the town of Blacksburg. How are things looking there?
Hi, thanks so much. So I'm going to pull up my slides. But before I do that, I just want to say I love the policy nerd focus. It feeds my soul. But I am going to take a little bit of a pullback and talk about why this work is important to the town of Blacksburg. And so with that, let me share my screen. And somebody want to give me a thumbs up if I'm properly sharing it. Let me change the display setting. Nope, that's wrong. Is that right? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, good. Sounds great. And before I actually get into my slides, I promise Patrick and I did not coordinate ahead of time, but I would just like to say that I am a very satisfied client of Baseline Solar. Not only did they do the solar on my own house, but they have recently very nearly completed an EV infrastructure, electric vehicle charging infrastructure for my neighborhood project. And I believe it's the first one in Blacksburg, Patrick. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, so we're really excited about that. So if you're in the Blacksburg area, give these guys a call. They're fabulous. So I want to talk a little bit about the town of Blacksburg and what we've been working on. And the slide you've got in front of you is really just showing the legacy of how we've been working on this really since the mid-2000s. At the behest of citizens, they came to us and they really said, we're not seeing leadership at the national and international scale or at the state level. Something needs to happen. And so that started us on a path, and we've continued to add to that, those commitments, or double down on those commitments, reinforce them. And I want to point your attention towards three in particular. In 2015, when Town of Blacksburg joined the Compact of Mayors, which was a compact to be leaders on the issue of climate change. The subsequent year, we completed our climate action plan, and those are related. And in this most recent year, in fact, yesterday, I presented our community climate vulnerability assessment to our town council. So I want to talk a little bit about that Compact of Mayors that we joined in 2015, and it's a commitment that has two sides of the house. On the one side, it's mitigation. It's really looking at the need to quickly and efficiently draw down on the amount of carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere. So that part of the commitment is to take stock of your greenhouse gas emissions, set a target, and develop a plan to reduce it. The adaptation side of it, we really only started working on last year, which is, even if we're doing everything right, we also need to take stock of what amount of climate change is already baked in for our area, and sort of take stock of that, assess what hazards are most likely to occur, where we might be vulnerable, and then develop an adaptation and resiliency plan to address that. So let's see. So in 2016, as I said, we completed that climate action plan. In the years since, so that was toward the tail end of 2016, we've been working really hard to actually operationalize this plan. So we've been working, I've been working with the planning department and the town manager's office to get this really aligned and integrated into our comprehensive plan. We've also been doing that with our budgeting, particularly around transportation projects. And on and on. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we're also starting to put our toe in the water in, as Ivy knows, into state policy advocacy. We're also looking at what opportunities do we have as a local government that we can pursue in the APCo service territory to do large renewable energy opportunities. And much more recently, the town has decided to actually get engaged in utility renegotiation of that contract. So, and then this brings me to this last piece, which is the climate vulnerability assessment. And this is really the piece I wanted to share with you all, which is, you know, I think when we think about climate change, I would expect that this is a fairly climate and energy sophisticated audience, but I still think that there isn't a great sense of what type of climate vulnerability we are facing here in Southwest Virginia, and more specifically in Blacksburg. I think folks think climate change means sea level rise and maybe desertification and wildfires, but we're looking at a whole suite of potential hazards here in Blacksburg. So for folks, forgive the cartoon, but I think this is a helpful example for folks who don't really think in terms of hazard mitigation planning. But in this example, so the Mount Vesuvius, the volcano, is the thing that does the damage. And the vulnerabilities are the who and what in your community that can get damaged, the people and the infrastructure, the buildings of Pompeii in this example. And then the risk is really where those things intersect, the estimated degree of impact to the people and services, the infrastructure, the things that make a community run, weighed against how adaptable or how resilient is that community? What can you really do to plan and prepare for those hazards? So again, on the sort of Mount Vesuvius end of the scale, we're looking at the types of climate hazards that might be coming to our area. Very clearly, there's some temperature and precipitation related ones that there's great data and modeling for, that there's a high degree of confidence in those models, less so on wind related and other anticipated impacts, but it's difficult to model them. It doesn't mean we don't plan for them. It's just saying there's less certainty about the frequency or the intensity of how these things are going to occur. And then on the community side of it, the vulnerability side, we are really looking at what large buckets of things in our community could this affect. So one is people in community, different elements of that, the natural world, economy, employment, and infrastructure and basic services. And the work that we've done over the last year is really to take a deep dive into the data and take a look at how all of these might intersect. And I've got some examples here, but really it was taking a look at almost each one of these climate hazards and assessing it relative to every single one of these community systems, these critical community systems. So if you can do that math, that was a lot of analysis. So what we arrived at is very broadly, the town of Blacksburg is going to be experiencing hotter summers, warmer winters, and changing precipitation patterns. I'm going to take you just on a real quick spin through our hotter summers chapter. And I want to zero in on this data point because I think this is one of the really concerning things that we're looking at. For Montgomery County, Virginia, we have some hot days, but not a ton. The historical average is about 4.5 days above 90 degrees per year. And under a low emission scenario, that's those yellow arrows, that's our best case scenario. That's if everyone, not just Blacksburg, every community in Virginia, every community in the world does the right thing. And we bring our greenhouse gas emissions down dramatically. That's our best case scenario. So we need to start planning for that outcome, right? By mid-century, that's a dramatic increase. Under a high emission scenario, which is we don't take this really seriously, and we kind of continue on a business as usual pattern, the outcome is really, I think, sort of unthinkable. I don't know how we really plan for that as a community. And then similarly, we took a look out at a larger scale too, We've got historical averages at the national scale, a low emissions scenario by mid-century, and a high emission scenario by end of century. And you can see that that might impact a lot of systems, for the way we grow food, to stress on the energy grid, and also just human health and well-being. What does this world look like for us? So going back to how we did this, we asked ourselves questions for each potential climate hazard. Did we have good data on probability frequency? We went through each of these questions to essentially ask two broad questions. What is the potential impact of a given climate metric on a community system? And what realistically is the town of Blacksburg's adaptive capacity? How practical or technologically feasible? What local control do we have? And do we even have the resources to pursue those adaptations? And so we kind of threw them all into a matrix along, so folks who are familiar with asset management might recognize that sort of heat mapping of risk prioritization. And where things shook out is, for the case of hotter summers, we saw that many of our community systems that fell under people and community and natural systems were pretty highly impacted, those darker colors indicating a higher degree of risk. And then, won't take through you all of them, but we saw a similar thing for warmer winters. People in community and the natural systems were most impacted, almost exclusively, by warmer winters. And then changing precipitation patterns had a more diffuse impact, also bringing in some impacts to infrastructure and basic services, but again, more strongly, more directly and severely impacting people in community and natural systems. So for us, next step is I'm going to stand up 4 teams to start planning a food resiliency and security plan for our community and hopefully our region. Another team on human health and well-being. How do we adapt to these, particularly like hotter summer issues that can have a real impact? There are anticipated devastating impacts to biodiversity and ecosystems in our region. And also, how do we plan for infrastructure? The infrastructure we're putting in the ground today, is it going to be designed for that future climate in mind? So I'll just close it out with this. Local governments are not comfortable doing work that's outside of that incrementalist framework. That's sort of what we're built for, is to slow and steady and try out different things. And I think we have had 30 years of largely ignoring the climate crisis. And incrementalism may not work at this point. We really don't have that left to us. And I'll leave you with this other thought is, who's on the hook for these changes and these outcomes? Local governments are increasingly on the hook for dealing with the impacts to infrastructure and their citizens and the local economy and the natural world, but also individuals are on the hook. So we have to figure out a way to make that fair and hold people accountable for who have sort of created those circumstances. So with that, I will give it back to Ivy.
Thanks, Carol. That's impressive that you guys have done such a deep dive on climate impacts, and I hope you're having an influence on some of the other jurisdictions. I suspect you're way out ahead. We're going to turn it now over to Aaron Sutch from Solar United Neighbors. Aaron single-handedly negotiated the HOA bill this year that is making such a difference for people in homeowner associations. So he is a veteran of the advocacy from the General Assembly as well. Aaron, go ahead.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, those are very kind words. Thank you, Ivy. It's a pleasure to be here. I do not have any slides for you, but I wanted to just speak briefly, give you an introduction to Solar United Neighbors, why this issue is important to the constituency that we represent, and actually me personally, and then some of the benefits and opportunities we see specifically with this contract negotiation. So if you're not familiar with the work of Solar United Neighbors, we're a nonprofit organization that helps communities go solar join together and fight for energy rights. We started in 2010 in Washington, D.C., literally with a mom and her son working out of their house trying to help people go solar. Fast forward, we're now in 12 states. We've just completed our over 5,300 installations in the 12 states that we work. And here in Virginia, as part of our Go Solar programs, we worked with great advocates like Carol Davis to help bring the first Solarize program to Virginia. And as a result, we have done about 900 installations in Virginia. That's about $17 million in retail solar sales and about 7 megawatts worth of installed capacity. That's an industrial scale level of solar on individual rooftops. And I think what perhaps we're the most proud of is that we represent a constituency of solar owners and prospective solar owners. So our job is to really facilitate the voice of people. And I will tell you why this issue is important to us. We represent a nonpartisan, actually a non-environmental constituency. Sorry, Sierra Club folks, we are not an environmental group. And that's because solar has such broad support amongst a variety of demographics and of political affiliations. In fact, it's one of the few things that brings us together as a nation right now in these divided times. Polling is anywhere between about 85 to 90% of support for solar, and that transcends demographics. And so a lot of the folks that we represent are environmentally motivated, but many are not. Many are libertarian, conservative folks that believe in their right to generate clean local energy in their community. They believe in the benefits of creating jobs, the kind that Patrick pointed to before. And they believe in the smartness, actually, of building resilient climate solutions with solar and battery storage. So those are the folks that we represent. And in our work, probably the most common question that we get is when we help somebody go solar on their home or business, the second question after everything is the dust is settled is, how can I help put solar on my son's or daughter's schools? How can we get those same benefits that I'm seeing in my utility bill? How can we get those to local governments and schools? And so that is really the kind of people that we represent. I think that the take-home message is that people want this. It's a technology that people want because it has so many benefits. And a personal story is that I used to be a public school teacher. I was a middle school teacher for 4 years. And I remember getting the emails every Friday saying, make sure you power down your computer. Make sure that you power off your HVAC unit because we want to avoid those costs. And I remember decision makers, administrators making tough decisions between paying rising energy bills or cutting programs. So this is an issue that really cuts, again, across party lines, but it's also something that's very personal. Additionally, in our work, as what Ivy said, is that we're seeing solar take off in other parts of Virginia, not just on residential and commercial facilities, but we're seeing it take off in other parts of Virginia, specifically on schools. In fact, Virginia actually ranks among the top 10 for solar on schools. And in the last, I think the data point is, in the last 2 years, we've seen a 10-fold increase in solar installations on schools in other territories, specifically Dominion. But in 2019, rural electric cooperatives actually expanded PPA options to schools in their territory. And of course, with all of the legislative progress that we're seeing. So we're seeing a lot of opportunities in that area. But we're also seeing, as Carol mentioned, the opportunities for resiliency. And keep solar with battery storage on site in a distributed fashion is the best way to keep the lights on in any sort of climate-related disaster. We're doing work in Puerto Rico. We've seen that in Florida. We're seeing it with California wildfires. It's just a smart solution. On-site solar is a really great way to harden your infrastructure. And our work in 2016 brought us to Newport News, Virginia, where we did an assessment. And we found that solar plus storage was a great way to harden communication centers to make diesel fuel go go further, not have so much reliance on interruptible supply chains. So it's just a smart decision that transcends kind of party lines and ideology. And those two things, or solar really rests on two things, and that was net metering and PPAs. You know, those are things that really facilitate the growth of solar. According to the DMME, we've got about 11 or 12,000 solar installations, and about 99% of those rely on net metering. And about 9 out of 10 school solar installations rely on PPAs. So any sort of limit on PPAs really is a limit on the growth of solar. It's blocking access to that technology. So I wanted to just close with some next steps and opportunities, you know, especially for our friends in the utilities. This is not a zero-sum game. There is a great opportunity for them to facilitate the inevitable transition to renewable energy, to build in resilient, reliable energy, and to capture a value for that. And I think with these public authority negotiations, specifically with raising the PPA caps and net metering, that offers some tremendous opportunities and some win-wins. So I will close with that. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And we are lucky to have Larry Jackson here from Appalachian Power to respond to the PPA issue, but also tell us how APCo is looking at solar these days.
Thanks, Ivy. Let me start out by speaking to a couple of things that you mentioned. You mentioned a contract dispute, and I think that you're going to find out this evening that there is no contract dispute. We're having discussions on what the contract should look like. And the other is that APCo doesn't want localities to use PPAs, and the bottom line is we don't care. You know, we were in the room and agreed to the 40 megawatts. So that said, let me do what Rick asked me to do, which is to go back and give you a little background as to where we are as a company. Number one, I think most of you know that APCo is a regulated utility, and because of that, our rates have to match whatever our costs are to deliver the energy. We have been and we continue to be known to focus on keeping our rates low, competitive, which is really important here in our part of the state, where our customer base is somewhat less affluent than in other parts of the state. So as we transition our operations to adopt the provisions of the VCEA, we'll continue to try to keep those rates as competitive as we possibly can. And that's really how we're approaching this discussion with the public authorities, because really there are two sides of that equation. There are not only with the public authority, but with all our customers. A lot of our customers want more renewables, but a lot of our customers also want high reliability and low rates. And so we're in the middle trying to make all that work, create that balance. You add on top of that there is very little economic growth happening in our part of the state, which provides a challenge because we've got a lot of things that we've got to get done. We've got to replace our generating fleet completely by 2050. We have to upgrade our grid because, as was alluded to by Carol, you know, we're going to face even more challenges than we've got now as the climate continues to change. We have managed to keep our rates flat for the last decade. We're just going in for right now the very first rate increase in a decade. But this low growth is really going to limit our ability to move forward and to cover a lot of these costs. So as we ramp up our renewable fleet, which we're in the process of doing right now, we will coincidentally be ramping down our fossil fleet with our goal in Appalachian and AEP being to reduce our carbon footprint to 0 by 2050 per the VCEA. And across all of AEP, we're trying to get to that 0 emission point. We have just announced that we're going to change our entire automotive fleet to electric by 2030, which it's going to be interesting. Don't look for our big bucket trucks and line trucks to be electric by then. That's a little more of a challenge, but we're going to be working with the State Corporation Commission to make sure that all this is taken care of as we move forward. It's going to be a long transition because it took us over 100 years to get to where we are now, and we're just starting to move. And we are moving. We announced several years ago our first solar facility, which will be just north of Blacksburg, Virginia. It is a PPA, by the way. We are in the process of announcing 2 other solar facilities in Virginia, and they didn't give me the leeway to tell you where they are, but hopefully we'll announce those pretty soon. And then earlier this year, we put out an RFP for 200 megawatts of solar to be sited in Virginia, and we're evaluating those as of now. Many of you may also know that we've had 5 large wind contracts now for a very long time in the Midwest and in West Virginia that have provided us a tremendous amount of renewable energy along with our hydro plants. So we're getting there, and it's going to be a slow process, but we've got, after the VCA passed, we assembled a huge team of experts to help us get there. And, you know, Aaron, like you mentioned, that a pretty good resiliency thing if you can get the solar or wind to match up with batteries. And we've also got a battery matched up with one of our hydro plants here on the New River. So we're trying a lot of things. We'll see where it goes. Again, we've got to do it with the idea of keeping the grid strong and keeping our costs low.
Thank you, and I apologize if I mischaracterized what's going on with the contracts, and maybe James can explain it some more. I'm delighted that it sounds like you're okay with localities using PPAs. I thought that was central, but we're going to let James talk for a minute, and then maybe we'll have a chance to kind of circle back and get some more clarity there. So.
All right. First off, I have a very big dog who gets really noisy from time to time. So if that happens, I'll deal with it. You may see me head off this way to throw him in the basement. But I think I've calmed him down.
You won't be the only one.
Yeah. I want to give you some background so you understand. All cities, counties, and towns in Virginia that have jails, water plants, schools, municipal buildings, rec fields, ball fields, football fields, you name it, everything that consumes electricity came together back in the 70s, over 40 years ago, to say, hey, we should negotiate rates with our respective utilities because it's in the citizens and business best interest. So a group formed to talk to our APCo partners, and a group formed to talk to those other folks on the other side of the state. And so 40 years, our focus has been on an absolute low electric bill for these municipal entities, because much of your viewers or your other folks don't realize we use a lot of juice. It takes a lot of electricity to run sewage pumps. It takes a lot of electricity to make water. We are big consumers, and if you put us all together, we're probably one of their largest single aggregate customer classes. So when we sit down and talk to them, 40 years ago, we got on the same page that it was in the taxpayers' interest to have cheaper utility rates for municipal or public authorities. And we've had that as our core and driving focus for that nearly half century in which we've been doing this. So it's like it was said earlier, we were not an environmental group. We're being pushed in that direction because of the changing tides, but our core focus was saving the taxpayers' dollars, keeping electricity low, therefore keeping water rates low, trash rates low, sewer rates low. And we've hit home run after home run of doing that because AEP partnered with us 40 years ago saying, okay, you know what, we'll give you a deal. We'll let you negotiate your rates on the cost of service. We'll sit down every 3 years, you'll hire a bunch of accountants and attorneys, and we'll do the same, and we'll figure out what it costs to serve you. And that'll be your rate. And it covers your rate for your traffic lights, it covers your rate for your street lights, and it's a complex animal. And it took a long time, but over time, it got fairly standard. It got easier. Well, then last time we did this contract, we had a wild idea, a crazy idea. We said, you know, nobody's asking for it, but let's put in some net metering. Larry, you may recall, we put in 4 megawatts and no one knew. It was like under the radar. We just sort of slipped it in and it went unused. Right up until about 18 months ago, it just took off. Up until 12 months ago, I had not heard from a single locality of wanting more. This has ballooned out of folks saying, "Whoa, you know, what's going on?" Well, we're reacting. We're changing the position. And as Larry commented, AEP in no way wants to slow down the PPA rollout. They signaled to us the day the legislation passed that they're going to work with it. If you've got school districts or other folks in your area that are wanting to move forward with projects because of the attractive tax position, our guidance to them was move on. And at a minimum, as we look at creating a new rate structure, the Virginia Clean Energy Act and its targets and rates will be folded into that. But herein lies the problem. If you rewind what I was saying earlier, AEP has helped us for all these years. Don't you chew that. Stop. The noisy bone away from him. AEP has helped us for all those years with rates that are generally based on the cost of service. So if a certain percentage of the ratepayer goes off and does a large net metering, be it solar or what our town is interested in, solid waste, it impacts their dollars and cents. And so our rates change. And we had to sign on for that with that relationship. So the more folks go and become slightly more self-sufficient with some of these local generation projects, the rate changes. And I'll be honest, Larry said, let's not, we're not going to share any secrets, but I will share a quote. He said, look, whatever you want, you can have. We just got to figure out how to pay for it. And that's the position we're at, is we want a rate that's fair for, say, the Giles County, which doesn't pursue any of these options, and for, say, a Radford or Blacksburg, where these options are aggressively pursued. Because what will ultimately happen is that one rate will have to make up the revenue that's impacted by net metering or by these new facilities, and so that the service area or the service territory as a whole comes out even, because that's the benefit we've always had, is we just pay for what we're going to get. The impact there, Larry mentioned that we're not growing as a region. Now, so Dominion, they're having double-digit year-over-year growth, and the impact of these changes to them, which is why you're seeing it so heavily adopted in that region, can be absorbed on the margin. AEP's flat, and we're going to be flat. So the only real challenge we have is looking into a crystal ball and saying how much of this is going to get used, and what does that look like in terms of a rate, so that we can avoid upward rate pressure for, say, a Giles County, and then allow a Roanoke City Schools or a Blacksburg City to use some of these features. So at a minimum, there is no arm wrestle right now over PPA and limits. The real question that we've got to figure out is how do we allow localities that can access this technology to have these savings, but not have those savings immediately become rate metric increasers for the poorer localities in our footprint that are not pursuing this. And it's not as complex as you would think. There aren't any great contentions or conflicts. It's a real question of how do we make this work? Because you got to factor in, well, how much of this will happen? What will that do to demand? And what is the cost of backhaul? And the cost of backhaul is not insignificant, because if you use a very rural school system in the APCo territory, and they put in a very significant solar facility, and you have to backhaul that to some usable way, that cost gets factored in as well. So big picture, for the last 40 years, we've negotiated rates for Virginia localities within the APCo footprint We've done it based on the lowest cost of service we could obtain, and we've saved the taxpayers millions and millions and millions of dollars. Here lately, we've had this environmental twist being thrown in because it's a perfect storm. What's good for lowering our carbon footprint is suddenly good for paying less taxes. And we certainly want that because we're all making budgets work in lean times. APCo has signaled we're willing to do anything that you come up with, but where the due diligence is making sure that the rate that survives is still a good deal for folks out in the Western territories. Again, the challenge in a regulated environment is a guaranteed return on equity, a base cost of service, and an expectation that there is no reduction in service availability and grid availability and in service restoration. So all it really boils down to is where is that sweet spot? If we plan for, say, 100 megawatts, and in the end of the contract, we were only using 15 or 20, it means that we've arrived at a rate that had a very bad crystal ball, in that we were paying a little more than needed for everybody to allow for this larger capacity. But as a baseline, we've not received anything from AP or APCo in any way other than, yeah, we'll work with VCEA, we'll keep moving, and that is a starting point for what we're looking at putting together for the next 3 years. But the real focus is on what is the residual rate for all of these water treatment plants, schools, sewage treatment plants, these really high energy users that have thus far for long periods of time had very below market utility bills that versus, say, a private sector entity that had those same demands. So we hear our constituent localities loud and clear. They don't want any limits on how they can finance, fund, and engage in these new and interesting projects. They want limits that don't constrain their options, and we're certainly going to go to bat for that. Based on the trend we're seeing, the VECA 40 is probably a target we won't reach during this 3-year agreement. I don't know how much we're likely to reach over time. You mentioned the private schools asked for, a big PPA amount, and they didn't use any of it. But we're certainly going to put the tools on the table as we pivot from not only being a really great aggressive cost savings group to one that factors in some of these environmental concerns, because it's a win-win for both options. But as things stand, we typically always take a back seat anyway while our utility, be it APCo or Dominion, is going through their triennial rate case, because they've only got so many folks. And up until about a week ago, most of 3 weeks ago, most of AEP's folks were tied up with the SCC case. But at this point, I don't see too many hurdles other than making sure that the residual rate not only allows, say, Blacksburg, Roanoke City schools to save by making these investments, but doesn't shift a lot of that burden out further west in the state where they're least equipped to handle it. And that's the real hard math that we're doing.
So, James, we're gonna turn this into a sort of a roundtable discussion and let the other panelists respond. But I did want to ask, because I'm left a little bit confused with both what both you and Larry have said. Does this mean the contract will allow the solar PPAs? Because I had been under the impression that that was going not to be allowed under the contract going forward, that even though we've got a 40 megawatt bucket here that local governments and schools can participate in, that the contract was still not going to permit that. Is that incorrect?
You just had AEP themselves tell you that was incorrect.
Okay, well, I'm really glad to hear that. Okay, so so I'm delighted that we don't have that issue, because I was under the impression there was. Carol, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I just want to clarify your clarification. That means for municipal customers, there is no objection to PPAs for municipal customers, correct? I'm
Not from
looking at
APCo.
Larry and James.
Yeah, no, when the VCEA came out, it was AEP's position that they stated to us as an entity that they would work with it even pending this renewal. And at a minimum, the renewal should fold in these legally set milestones. The only question there's ever been has been, what does that look like on the rate side?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I ask a follow-on question? Has there been any discussion about virtual net metering? I think for our locality, and I believe I've spoken to Delegate Hurst's office about this, we have a capped landfill in our region, about a 50-acre property. Of course, a landfill has no electricity load, but we have lots of other, municipal customers who would love to virtually net meter the power from that. Would that be something that APCo would consider?
I may have to call a friend. Ivy, do you remember the bill from last year? I can't remember it. It had something about the municipalities generating and using another facility. Aaron, do you remember?
I believe that was Dominion, and I think it was a specific pilot for Fairfax County.
So there is one of the provisions of Solar Freedom allows Fairfax County to move forward with a solar landfill project there. I know what you may be referring to, Larry. Last year, there was a very limited municipal allowance for some projects that wouldn't be net metered, but would cover that kind of thing. Might still be just Dominion territory. So,
well, I don't know, for some reason I was thinking City of Roanoke. Luke, I don't know if you remember that or not, but anyway, sorry. Again, this will go back to the negotiation. If that's something that the municipalities want, then we can certainly talk about it.
Aaron, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I wanted to elevate, because this is something that we see quite a bit. And what we see a lot is the false dichotomy between penetrations of solar and somehow raising rates. And I heard Mr. Ervin, you make that point repeatedly. And I will just ask that, do you have any data to support that? And when I say data, I mean full cost of service that takes into account solar's benefits to all ratepayers, namely in reducing peak demand, also the deferral of transmission upgrades. Do you have any data to show that, to link that point that you seem to make?
Yeah, you've got to realize we're coming at it from the bottom of the barrel, not from the top, in that if we have an aggregate customer base, which we have a big book, it's all electronic now, but we sit down at the table with APCo and say, here's every single encounter you have with this entire customer. We become one customer, and we have a total kilowatts used, stem to stern. And we get a price for those kilowatts based upon the cost of providing it to us. And then it becomes simple math of saying, well, what if we pull this many megawatts out of that equation? You have has their cost changed? And the end result is that your recoupable income, if we're targeting cost of service, impacts the residual kilowatts. And it's not that complicated to say, here's everything we've used, and this is what it cost, and here's what we're going to use going forward. Now, granted, it's very small. It's microscopic if you look at the entire footprint. So, but it's just a simple math equation. If we arrive at an audited, approved cost of service, divide that by the kilowatts sold, that's the proposed starting point. If we shave off 40, 50 megawatts off that, you're increasing that kilowatt charge, but it is microscopically. But that's generally the focus. It's not, does solar pay for itself? Yeah, no one disputes that it does on a functional basis. What we're talking about is us as a customer if we start buying slightly less, how does that impact our overall rate?
So then you'd have to pay more. So with that logic, then the Roanoke City Schools looked at just upgrading its HVAC systems to save about 20% on their usage and cost there. But would that mean that by saving money that way, that the rate would have to increase for localities otherwise?
It would probably year over year have a slight increase, because what you've got to realize, we're paying a rate that's based on the cost of service. And so if everybody got really, really efficient, are we going to have dramatically lower cost of service? Probably over time. It will probably take the utility time to react, to adopt different business processes. But it is not necessarily as simple as, I pulled out. Good example is, what if, a lot of our larger localities and jurisdictions suddenly get amazingly energy efficient? For a period of time, it would have an upward pressure on what we negotiate, because again, we're going back to that cost of service, which has to do with grid capacity, availability, restoration, maintenance, those types of things. And we trade that information in really big complex spreadsheets in which we say, okay, here's what it costs to be on the ground and do these things. And if you suddenly remove a lot of kilowatts or megawatts, in this case, you do arrive at a slightly higher number. Is it measurably so? Not typically. But we have to, in good faith, agree to what that number is going to be. And they, in good faith, tell us, here's what we think that number is going to be. And that's really where the work is at, is in horse trading over, does this really change it? But again, it's microscopic changes. These aren't giant changes.
But again, I'm not really hearing any type of complete accounting for the benefits of solar. And to the point about if somebody's energy efficiency, is there a certain clause in the contract that each of the facilities or customers has to consume a certain amount of energy? Is that part of it? Okay, I got it.
No, I mean, that's where it is in each customer's benefit to save, to adopt a lower carbon footprint. And we sit down at the table frequently enough that that's generally rolled in. You sit down with the big spreadsheet and say, here's every kilowatt hour you used. What does that do to your rate structure? We certainly encourage folks to get more energy efficient and to go the right way. It doesn't change how we negotiate the rate, because rate is demand versus cost. And typically it happens frequently enough that over time it works out. Now, again, up until a year ago, that was the only focus, which is every 3 years we sit down and say, how much did we use? What did it cost you to make it? What's that equal? And much like the SCC filings, our dear partners at AAP would say, well, we had to buy this, we had to buy that. And we'd say, you can't count that, you needed that anyway. Much like the SCC process. So keep in mind, this is only relevant because we are in a special class in which we get a really great rate. Now, I will tell you, as the representatives of the localities involved, we have said we're prepared to bear the cost of rolling in these new things. Now, the question is how much that is.
One last question. So let's just say you have 6% of your customers. Do you have any, could you show with data that let's say 6% of those municipal customers choose to have net metered solar? Do you have any data point showing that there would be a cost increase? That's really what I'm asking for, because it's a pretty, you mentioned it's a pretty low number. So you're mentioning the cost increase. What type of data?
Our rate analysis, folks, if we said reduce demand by 6% and then recalculate an effective rate, yeah, that can be shown to you.
I'd be interested. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a giant Excel spreadsheet that says here's everything we use. And believe it or not, we bill our localities, our member localities, using that exact same data, in which we say how much did Blacksburg use total kilowatt hours, how much did Roanoke use total kilowatt hours, And we use that as a basis of how we fund what we do. Because again, in our eyes, it's all about usage. Now we're perfectly willing to pivot and say, we will embrace the adoption of these diverse technologies. My locality especially is looking keenly at going down this road. The challenge is to roll that into a cost of service rate structure. And I don't think it's going to be difficult. I think it's just a question of figuring out how we do it right so that year over year it gets better, it gets, more refined and more effective.
So James, it would be my dream to get to 6% in terms of distributed solar. We're a long way from there at this point, and certainly the 40 megawatts isn't going to get us there, even if that were
right.
all the localities.
Even if your 40 gets used.
A question which is about the you mentioned electric vehicles and the question of where demand goes, and so what are you looking at in terms of vehicle electrification? Because that will increase electric demand as we shift away from gasoline use, and also there's a good push towards building electrification, and as we're trying to decarbonize the entire economy, we need to take fossil fuels out of heating and cooling buildings and use electricity. So what are your projections in terms of those replacing demand that you lose from energy efficiency and rooftop solar?
Well, Ivy, I think we're going to put you on our economic development team because you've definitely got the speech down. But if we're going to grow the economy in Southwest Virginia, and you may know that there is a group, including our friend Mike Karmas from Virginia Tech, on the Southwest Virginia Research and Development team, they're looking at ways that we can develop storage, that sort of thing in Southwest Virginia. There are three really good friends that we'd like to see in Southwest Virginia. Number one is electric vehicles, which would have a good impact in a number of different ways, and they're dropping in price and increasing in efficiency. Just, if you don't believe me, just ask Rick because he has got a new one. But the second thing would be data centers, which we've got a tremendous amount of capacity for data centers in Southwest Virginia that don't require a lot of additional infrastructure. And then inside agriculture would be another big benefit for Southwest Virginia. But to your point on the electric vehicle issue, we've got a whole team at AEP working on electrification of passenger vehicles, of course, but then again, as you mentioned, the electrification of other industrial processes such as forklifts. And if you've ever worked around a warehouse, you know what the smell of propane off of forklifts is like. And it's something where we really have a good fit because they use the forklifts during the day and then they can charge the forklifts at night. Perfect for the demand curve that we've got right now. So we believe that electric vehicles are going to take off. We believe in it enough to where we said we're going to do it by 2030 for our own fleet. And I know there's already a push in a number of localities to do the same. And so we believe that that's a nice addition to our load. Right now, there's talk about putting the electric vehicle charging stations along the I-81 corridor. That just began, and as you begin developing this infrastructure, you'll get these groups that'll come in and fill that. So we think it's a great potential for us. Thanks for asking.
Ivy, can I jump onto that point? I will just add, from a personal perspective as well as in my work, I'd like to ask perhaps Larry Jackson, but also some of the folks who work with our legislators, would they support legislation in the upcoming session for new multifamily developments and other like condo associations and townhomes where parking is not integrated into the home in a garage, where essentially your parking is somewhat segregated from your home? Would you support legislation to either create incentives or mandate that developers not necessarily build out the EV infrastructure, but build out the rough-in or just the conduit. Because I can say from a personal perspective, and Patrick can assert to this, it is very hard to do after the fact. We just, in our neighborhood, it was hideously expensive and complex to do. Our community was built 20 years ago, and it is really rough stuff to do after the fact. So I'd love to hear what y'all think about that.
Well, I think you're going to see it in new developments. Just before this call, I was on a call with the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors and listened to a new development going in Charlottesville, and they're automatically putting in electric vehicle charging station because there's a demand for them now. If you've got a new, and you're right, Carol, to do it after the fact is abysmally hard for us and for the property owner. But I think it's going to come on its own. Others may have a different view.
But could there be anything done even for redevelopment? Because with the state of the economy right now, especially like in Roanoke, I don't see a lot of new development potentially coming in the next 3 to 5 years. So there's going to be a lot of redevelopment of our old warehouses and buildings that could use some new infrastructure layout like this.
Well, I think you're right, Luke. As you get into the redevelopment, you're going to see it. You know, when APCo built our parking garage there, when we renovated Franklin Road, we've got 21 spots in there. I'm glad we did it now that we made this commitment. If you look down on the market, you've got 2 spots there. I think that's going to increase as people are more involved. But you're right. Now, the question that came up is, do you legislate it or do you let it happen naturally? I think localities would be ideal for that. And James, did you have a comment on that?
Right. I just, unrelated to the contract, I just finished as the president of the Virginia Managers Association. Your forward-thinking localities are already saying, how do we fold electric vehicles into our subdivision ordinance? How do we fold it into these things where a developer says, hey, I'm going to build all these houses? Well, what is your plan? Believe it or not, we're also saying, what do we do with all these gas stations we don't need? From a planning and land use standpoint, the emergence of electric vehicles, you know, the forward-thinking localities are already rolling that in to say, fast forward, what are we doing with all these dilapidated, no longer needed service stations as we slowly get forward? And how do we adjust our planning and land use rules to account for EVs? Just thought I'd throw that out there.
So I don't think the market is quite there yet. And I will say that I sit in on development review and development decisions that are coming into the town of Blacksburg. We see a lot of multifamily. We're a 70% renter occupied community. I keep trying to make the case to people who are developing student housing and other multifamily, believe me, this is in your best interest, at minimum, to run the conduit. This is going to be a critical selling point for your customers down the road, and they're just not persuaded by it. And so I think at this point, I can see the writing on the wall. They're going to come to regret this decision, but they still think that this is not real or not the trend line. So again, I ask the question, I think what is needed at minimum is enabling legislation for localities to require this as a part of development. It's going to save them money in the long run. They're just not convinced of it yet. And I think it's a win-win for the utility.
Oh, it definitely is. And if you want to convince these developers, just have them drive an electric. If they've never driven an electric and they drive one, you'll be convinced.
They freak out because you can't hear the engine, though.
Well, that's true. I can't help that, Luke.
I had a question for Larry and James about, James, you were talking about the PPAs shifting cost from, from everybody to concentrating it on the customers who wouldn't be using PPAs, and how that might shift things from more affluent people to less affluent people. And I guess I'm thinking that a lot of these projects will happen, if a lot of them are going to be PPAs, a lot of the public authority projects are going to be PPAs, then someone else is going to be putting up the money, and the rate, people aren't going to go for it unless the rate is less than the rate that you guys already have. So I would guess most localities would get the same deal, and so developers then they wouldn't necessarily have any incentive to pick more affluent or pick projects based on any kind of wealth. They might be picking them based on other things, So I'm wondering why that was, how that kind of fits with your understanding of it and your view of it.
Well, usually you applied the PPA. Our logic is net metering as a whole. And you're right to say, well, I don't understand. PPA would be fair always. Our focus is on net metering, but a good example would be, what would your company's cost of mobilization be to go 5 counties over? Would it be a more expensive project? How would you service and maintain that? How would you meet your collective rules? I mean, could you do it with the exact same rate you're going to charge something in your existing locality? And when we talk about the increase in costs, keep in mind, we're talking fractions of a cent on a kilowatt hour. We are such a giant consumer that even if you put in 40 or more megawatts off the top of this, the end result is, it's really small. We're not talking even noticeable. But the challenge is how do you build in a metric to say, was it fair? Was it accurate? Was it accountable? Because again, our goal is that we're paying what it costs them to service. And we're not talking about so much pennies a kilowatt hour as we are slices of pennies, very small changes, because we're talking about a very small bucket, itty bitty bucket. Now, what we hope is over time, it's going to get bigger. And we need to figure out how to handle that early. And that's why it's important that we give this a lot of thought. But a 40 megawatt bucket is barely noticeable. But maybe in 20 years, maybe if you folks, you bright, energetic folks, get this to 400 or more, we need to know how to work with the incumbent utility in a way that they can move with it. And that's really the focus of that issue when it's based on cost of service, to say, you've had this much pull out on the consumption side, and here's what we're asking for now. But in terms of 40 megawatts, that is really small, and it's not really going to impact the overall to the extent a lot. But PPAs, in theory, there should be folks who are willing to serve 3 or 4 counties over and not charge a lot more. We hope so, anyway.
I hear you on that. I mean, what you're saying is true. If something's closer to me, it's easier for me and better cost. So I definitely agree with you on that, and I can see that being a part of it. Can I ask another question, I guess, about, and this is maybe related to what Aaron was asking. Is it, you have said, if I've heard you correctly, that there's the cost of service and the amount used. And if the amount used goes down, well, then the cost of service is still there. And so then the rate has to go up. And I guess what I'm wondering is it a safe assumption to say that having solar on the grid really makes the cost, really doesn't affect the cost in a positive way? That it drops revenue, but maybe it also drops cost, that there aren't some possible, energy is being created at peak times, so energy can be sold on the grid elsewhere. And is it possible that it's not just this is a negative, but it's a positive?
Yeah, if you get to the point where you've got enough online capacity during some neighboring utilities peaking period, and it can then be sold, managed, and horse traded in that capacity, it can then come in as an offset. But the effort to try and create that entire foundation, in fact, that's one of the things we've suggested to AP is, hey, you're a winter peaking, at least, right now, until the Carol's prognosis of climate change is hit. So they may shift into a summer peaking, but for the duration being a winter peaker, there's a whole lot of potential to take that summer generation and make money with it. Those are things that will change that discussion and dynamic as the years roll on, but we do need to get past, even if we look at the 4 megawatt that's largely in place now, if you look at every project that's on the books or been asked for, you're probably only looking at another 8. So we really got to pile more on before we can determine, is this something that's a marketable commodity? Does it impact rates? But that's the answer to your question of when do we get to the point where it doesn't get lopsided? You get to the point when you make enough to sell it.
Yeah.
But in other words, Mr. Ervin, you really don't have data at small penetrations to show that there's any sort of cost shift, because that's what we've seen time and time again across utilities is they repeat a talking point, but they can't provide any data to show that there's going to be cost increases. Let's be conservative with penetrations of solar in their customer base, 5% or below.
Not at that metric. What we have is an aggregate class of customers, a net kilowatt used, an audited cost of providing those kilowatts, and then we arrive at a rate. And what we've got to do is say, if we're not going to grow our economy and grow our facility, and that number actually is shrinking, we've got to take that into account. Of course, our hope is that that number will continue to go up year over year. But in terms of the base math, yeah, we start with, here is the total consumption. And here is, after much arm wrestling and much pointing of fingers and arguing, here is what we agree to is the cost of providing that. It's slightly different than a retail or commercial electric rate. But again, you talk about folks adopting these other.
Sorry, but I would even challenge you to in your aggregate customer class, to show that 5% demonstrations show any sort of data that shows that there's a cost shift. And I bet you can't do it, with all due respect.
Oh, no, not offense taken. I mean, it's simple math. If we reduce the amount of demand to 95%, in theory, hopefully we've got economic growth to come up with it. The problem is the demand doesn't change, but when we sit down and agree on attributable costs of services, can we cut those in some way?
But back to economic growth. I mean, doesn't it send a signal to bring developers in when schools are putting solar panels on their roofs, when municipalities are moving to electric buses? I mean, I'd see that municipalities really, they're not trying to remove themselves as customers.
No.
But they would like to shift where their usage is. And I think, what efforts could move forward to put some more of the solar here would hopefully send a signal to developers otherwise that this is a place that it's growing and moving forward. Otherwise, I don't see where we're going to generate the economic development in Southwest Virginia to begin with.
Yeah, you're entirely right. The majority of the forward-thinking customers are keen on moving in that direction. They're keen on saying, this is where we want to be. Let's figure out how, though, we can still sustain a grid we can rely on and service levels. And that's where it comes back. And that's where it's a very different conversation than I think you guys are expecting in terms of cost of service. Yeah, we're going to do these things. We're going to reduce consumption, but we're asking for this broader array of tools. Probably a good 15% of the members are saying this is really important. Now you have a lot of members who are saying, no, the lowest possible rate you can negotiate is important. We're taking the track that planning for the future means rolling in these options and learning to get this right so that 3 years from now it's better, and 3 years from now it gets even better, and to where it becomes a regular process. But you have a wide diversity in this service territory, but the leaders in it want to say, let us run with this and make it work. And we're certainly going to try and help them to the extent we can.
Could those two differing buckets who want the lowest rate and those who want the chance to move forward with solar, could those be split to negotiate, separately based on how their effect in all of APCo territory, so that you could keep the people who just want the lowest rate, keep them the same, and then have the other people take the risk on for themselves?
Well, it's possible. We're going to get them all together here in a week and say, here's where we are. What are your goals, objectives? I will say most of them, despite where their locality may be in the state, are incredibly forward thinking, because they're getting advice from folks like Carol of saying, this is where we're going to end up, regardless of how you may think or how you may work. As you go west, you get into more conservative areas of the state. To them, it's a physical challenge. In certain other pockets, it's a carbon footprint challenge. The reality is everyone's going to get on board with this is how they want to function. And our job is to figure out a way that they can continue to function that way and have a cost of service rate structure, so they're not calling up their local utility and saying, I want general service number one at this building, at my water plant. And I think it's possible to deliver both. I mean, I think right when VCEA came out and our APCo partners said, yeah, we'll certainly work with that number. Our job is to continue pushing for brutally low rates. Sorry, Larry. But the option for localities to move forward into this new space and to break ground for how to make it work.
So this is one of the things, one of the arguments in favor of the Clean Economy Act is ratepayer value. So everybody's kind of feeling their way towards the grid of the future, but we know that when we incorporate a lot of solar and wind, that we will be producing value for the customers. And we know that we've got to have a big role for customer-sided solar in that, because you've got all of these community benefits. And so I am delighted to hear so much agreement on this point. I want to make sure that Delegate Rust gets a chance to weigh in here. I know he's on the line, and as well, if Delegate Rust wants to speak. And then we do have a couple of people who've let me know through the chat box that they'd like to ask a question, and I think we'll have time. So Delegate Rust,
I think you meant Delegate Hurst.
I mean Hurst, I'm sorry.
I think you meant Delegate Hurst. Okay.
Sorry. I'm sorry, Delegate.
Hey, well,
And my delegate.
if Tom Rust was joining us, that'd be great.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Showing my age.
Sure, no worries, no worries. Well, it's good to be with everybody tonight and talking about a very important issue. I certainly think that we're continuing to deal with the impact of the VCEA and what effect that's going to have on the energy market. I think that a couple of things that have already been mentioned real quick that guide me when I look at energy policy in Virginia. The first is seeking parity between the two utilities, the two dominant utilities, phase one and phase two. I think that while Southwest Virginia and the APCo service territory has its own challenges, there is a huge disparity between what we have as mandated allowances for things like net metering. Again, if our cap isn't much higher than 4 megawatts, that's great, but it should be as high as what it could actually be utilized for. So if it needs to be 10 or 12, we should be moving to that end. I think also philosophically, now we have a new dynamic where people who are looking in the interest of ratepayers meaning residents and commercial entities. We heretofore had only really been thinking about policy as it relates to making sure that their rates are low and that the energy is reliable, that when you flip the switch on, the lights come on. I don't think that that can be a state and federal government approach anymore with the challenges that climate change presents. So if anything does come to pass with data being provided on total cost, where some communities are shortchanged or some localities find that rates go up, I think that the state and federal government would have a role to play in trying to offset that to make sure that we continue advancing toward that aggressive RPS that we have. And I think hopefully having a standard where we get to 100% clean energy ahead of the 2045 and 2050 goals, because now the interest of the ratepayer is not only on cost, but it's also on the viability of our energy production moving forward and the impacts of climate change. So those are things that maybe a municipality doesn't have to take into account, although I think Carol made an excellent point why localities do need to be thinking about that in addition to the bottom line, but that the state government certainly will be looking at all of those aspects in addition to what the SEC is required to review. And I think that, again, this is an opportunity for new technology to come into an industry that we really haven't seen in quite some time, especially not in energy, when you're going fundamentally from fossil fuels to a different mode of electricity generation. I think that we need to look at ways that maybe a non-vertical integration model will work by having more competition for more businesses that provide different options. You don't need a coal mine and a coal plant in order to generate power anymore. We have groups like Baseline Solar that are less than a mile away from me. I've been to their offices, and that means that that's a business that should be able to be viable in as many ways as possible. We don't want deregulation necessarily that failed a generation ago, but I think we do want a competition, that it's okay to have more fish in the pond swimming around, and that means that if there are implications because a loss of revenue from the generation side, from the resources side, happens to a utility that they're trying to make up for on the electric side, I have some sympathy for that. But again, we have gotten too enamored with a vertical model that I think is the technology and the innovation is really precluded against right now. So for residents and customers, they need to be empowered to have as many options as possible. For generators, they need to be able to operate in as many different spaces in Virginia as possible to help achieve the fiscal impacts that ratepayers are having to deal with, as well as also trying to satiate the demand that many ratepayers have for climate impacts. And then those who manage our grid and those who are our regulated utilities, I think still need to be able to get their ROI and still need to be able to recover their costs, but that their asset and portfolios might look different in the future. And that's something that needs to be planned for and welcomed rather than trying to be stymied. So, as far as specific legislation, with that general philosophy in mind, I'm receptive to whatever anybody brings. Had worked with Carol in the town of Blacksburg on trying to allow for some solar generation on the capped landfill. Pilot projects abound for Dominion. It would be great later if we could have some pilot projects for APCo, or at least some mirroring of pilot project parity between the two utilities. But when people come to me for ideas for legislation in the energy sector, I'm very interested in it and want to see how I can be helpful for it. I know, though, that Senator Edwards has been in the solar space for a lot longer than I have, and I don't know if Luke, on his behalf, can share about what the senator's thinking for all things solar. But I know whatever they're thinking, it's much more intelligent than whatever I have to say, Ivy. But it's good to be with all of you and appreciate it.
The senior solar senator from Southwest Virginia is what he's been called before. I'll have to talk to him about it more. I never know how he's going to vote till after he votes, or what he's going to do till after he's done it. But I will take everything that I've learned tonight back to him. It's nice to hear you, Delegate Hurst. Nice to see you, Larry Jackson, Ivy Main. I actually have to hop off. I'm sorry, that's my cue. But thank you for having me tonight. And I regret that Senator Edwards could not be here.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your subbing in there. And we did have a question. I'm not sure if I can do this, but I'm going to try. Can I unmute? Yeah, Gabby Gillespie wanted to ask a question. Gabby, I think you can do it.
Yeah, hey. Thanks, Ivy.
Hi.
Yeah, I just so I'm representing a really different part of Southwest Virginia than we've mostly been talking about. I live in Big Stone Gap in Wise County, and we've been pretty concerned about the potential rate hike. And I just want to kind of connect some of these disparate topics because y'all did bring up the rate hike, but I heard you talking about how a lot of the areas in Southwest Virginia are not affluent, very true, and that we're not seeing a lot of economic growth. And although this is the first rate increase in a decade, we're looking at a 6.5% increase, 65 million over current rates. And when we talk about a cost shift argument, Aaron, I really appreciate a lot of your comments, but we've been seeing this cost shift issue happening with fossil fuels, specifically coal. So I'm just curious as we talk about this cost shift, I know a lot of the burden on communities is to be paying for some early retirement on Clinch River 1 and 2, 3, Glenlyn, Kanawha River. So I'm just curious how these cost shifts are really any different from the coal retirements, the coal asset retirements we're seeing. And just any, I'm just curious what other ways y'all have explored to kind of shift these burdens, because not only are we in a pandemic and an economic crisis, but there's never a really good time to see a rate increase. And I know especially because we did just see one with ODP down here that a lot of people are really worried because they've seen huge changes in their bills for the folks who are in that utility zone. So we're looking at going from a fixed rate charge of $7.96 to $14. And just curious if y'all had any responses to any of that.
Well, let me jump in, Gabby. I was glad you mentioned that ODP, because we don't serve Big Stone Gap. I wish we did, by the way. We don't. You raise an issue, Gabby, that's a really good one to discuss with this group. And that is, as many of you know, Appalachian Power still has 3 coal plants in West Virginia. No longer have any coal plants in Virginia. We shut down Glenlyn and Chris Hurst area several years ago, and have just converted Clinch. So we're now no coal in Virginia, and Clinch is scheduled to retire in 26. But the issue of the fact that the Virginia ratepayers are still helping to pay for the capacity that we've got in West Virginia, we've got to figure out during this transition, how do you pay for the remaining cost of the coal plants that we've got while we're transitioning to a non-emission economy, since that's the way it was written into the VCEA. It's going to be a challenge for us, and we have an agreement now with the Sierra Club to do a deep dive on that, which we were going to do anyway, but it's going to be included in our next IRP, talking about when do you retire these coal plants? When is it best to do that? And then how do you pay for them? And what we're paying for really is the environmental controls that were put on those plants in 2007 and 2008. We spent $2.1 billion to put the environmental controls on, and now we've got to pay for them somehow. Had we known then what we know now, we probably would have just shut them down then. But it's a transition, and it's in everyone's best interest to make that transition as smart as we can, so we don't have further large increases like Gabby was talking about. So it's a good point, Gabby. Thanks for bringing that up.
I had a question, Ivy, if I may. You're on mute.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's really, so we're hearing a lot of, conversation. I really appreciate your perspective, Mr. Jackson, as well as Mr. Ervin's. Here's what we're dealing with. Just to give you some numbers of where we're looking. In APCo's territory, there is 22 kilowatts of solar capacity. That is enough to fit on the single rooftop of a house, compared to Dominion, which is 20,000. So 1,000 times more solar capacity in schools in Dominions. And I was just copied on an email to you, Mr. Ervin, from the Solar Energy Industry Association, as well as a solar developer. And they show a queue of about 7 projects that I estimate of about 8 megawatts worth of capacity that have not been able to move forward. So I'm hearing some really positive signs from you, Mr. Jackson, as well as Mr. Ervin, your perspective. But this is what we are facing. And I'd also add the perspective that in West Virginia, APCo, along with First Energy, has been in opposition to PPAs. They've actually killed bills that have had bipartisan support for PPAs. So my question is when I represent people, when I talk to people, I want to be able to, share their viewpoint. But this is really, it's a big bottleneck, and it's just putting Southwest Virginia behind. So what are the immediate plans right now to get these solar projects moving forward, to get people to work, and to actually solve this issue? Because the best legislation, from what I heard, solves a problem. We have a big problem. So that's my question. Sorry for the length.
Who do you want to take a swing at how to get those projects moving? Me or Mr. Jackson?
Whomever.
Two of the localities on that email have reached out to me, and I said AEP reports they're honoring the statements, rules, and requirements, and the VCEA proceed. Now that proceeding means going to their contract vendor and getting the final approval from their incumbent utility. But to my knowledge, we've not told anyone to hold back or hold fire. We've said, there he goes again. We've said our discussions with AEP are that they're going to work with the requirements of VCEA, approach them, and continue your project.
So can I just confirm that with Larry, that if a local government or a public school wants to go ahead with a PPA right now, there's not going to be anything to stop them from your point of view?
If we're talking about an entity that falls under the Public Authorities Agreement, that cap has been reached. Until we get a new contract, we'll not allow any to go forward.
But you could if you wanted to, right? There's nothing stopping you from allowing these projects to move forward, correct?
Well, we are still operating under the old contract, so that would be what would be stopping us.
But you theoretically could, you would have the jurisdiction to approve those projects, right? There's nothing as far as commission or any sort of regulatory issues that would prevent you from approving those projects as APCo. Is that correct?
Like I just told you, Aaron, the contract is what will stop us. That's what we agreed to operate under, and until that's renegotiated, we will not move forward.
Thank you.
But of course, we have your commitment now that the new contract won't have any restrictions. So we'll all we need to do is see the signatures, right?
Well, we will do whatever Mr. Ervin and the rest of the negotiation team comes up with. Because he hit the nail on the head. It's just a matter of balancing the cost.
All right. Well, we are have a vice presidential debate that starting in 5 minutes. I know a lot of you want to get to that. So Rick and Stockton, this seems like a good time to wrap up. If unless anybody else has any parting thoughts.
I want to thank everyone for participating today. I think this was an excellent discussion, and I appreciated what everyone had to say. And thank you so much for not only for our 8 presenters, but for the a large group of people that stayed with this entire conversation. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, and let's hope we have a good debate tonight.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.